Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another fascinating case?
Always.
Today we're diving into the world of maritime law and disability claims, with a story that might surprise you.
Maritime law, huh? Definitely has its own unique challenges.
You bet. We're looking at the case of Richie Chan, a seafarer who worked as a fireman on a ship.
Oh, a fireman. Tough job.
Yeah, and his story highlights just how complicated these cases can get. He was injured during a routine safety drill, a slip on deck, hurt his knee.
Happens all the time, even in the best conditions.
Right, you'd think they'd be prepared for that. So he received the initial treatment on board.
Pain meds, rest, the usual drill.
Yeah, exactly. But his knee, it just kept swelling, and the pain didn't let up. They ended up having to repatriate him back home for a more thorough evaluation.
Repatriation, that's never a good sign. Usually means things are more serious than they thought at first.
Definitely raises the stakes. But here's where the timeline gets interesting, and this is where the legal battle really starts to take shape.
Oh, I love a good legal twist.
Richie initially refused surgery, wanted some time to think things over, which is understandable.
Makes sense. It's a big decision.
But then he decides to go ahead with the surgery, and unfortunately, it doesn't improve his condition. This back and forth, the conflicting medical opinions, it's a recipe for a legal battle.
It sounds like a mess already. So how did this whole thing play out in court?
Well, buckle up, because we're heading into the world of the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, the POEA.
Ah, the POEA. They handle a lot of these seafarer cases, right?
They do, and there's this specific contract called the POEA SEC that basically sets the rules of the game for these kinds of claims.
It's like a rule book designed to protect both the seafarer and the employer.
Exactly. It lays out a very specific process and a strict timeline for everything.
Yeah.
Medical assessments, filing deadlines, dispute resolution, the whole 9 yards.
So Richie's case hinges on whether the company followed this POEA SEC rule book to the letter.
Exactly, and that's the million-dollar question. Was Richie wrongfully denied permanent disability, or did the company follow the rules and make a tough but legitimate call?
The plot thickens.
To answer that, we have to unpack the details. Let's start with the initial medical assessment Richie received once he was back home.
Okay, let's break it down. What did the company doctor say?
Well, the company-designated physician examines Richie and gives him a disability, grade 10.
Grade 10. Sounds serious.
You'd think so, but Right, so we've got this grade 10 assessment, which leaves some room for interpretation. Meanwhile, Richie's still in pain, not getting any better. He eventually goes through with that delayed surgery, but no improvements.
Oof, poor guy. So what does he do then?
Frustrated and still hurting, he decides to get a second opinion from an independent doctor.
Ah, the classic second opinion.
Oh.
Always adds another layer of complexity.
This independent doctor takes a look at Richie's condition and declares him unfit for sea duty. So now we've got a real conflict. Company doctor says grade 10, maybe he can work. Independent doctor says absolutely not, unfit for duty.
A medical standoff. How do they decide who's right?
Well, that's where our friend the POEA SEC comes back into play. It outlines the steps for resolving these disagreements between medical professionals. Yeah. And that's where the company's defense enters the picture. They argue they did everything by the book.
Every I dotted, every crossed, right? But I bet there's a catch.
You know there is. They have two main arguments. First, they claim Richie didn't follow the correct procedure by not immediately seeking a second opinion from another doctor.
Interesting. So they're saying he messed up the process.
That's their first point. And their second point, they're all about those deadlines. They claim they provided a final assessment of Richie's condition within the POEA SEC's timeframe of 240 days. There's some leeway there. It can be extended from 120 days under certain circumstances.
So they're saying they hit their marks, case closed.
Pretty much. They even point to a specific assessment, supposedly given on October 29, 2013, as proof that they fulfilled their obligations.
Oh,
but
yeah, how
there's always a but. Spill the beans. What's the catch?
The key question is, was that October 29th assessment truly what the POEA SEC considers final and definitive? Were there important details missing? Was it properly communicated to Richie? These are the questions that will determine everything.
Ah, so the devil's in the details. Sounds like we're about to get into some legal nitty-gritty. Exactly. And that's where the expertise of the court comes in. They have to untangle this web of medical opinions, deadlines, and procedures to figure out what really happened.
I'm on the edge of my seat already, so what did the court decide?
Well, you'll have to wait until part 2 to find out. But let me just say this. The court's decision in this case has big implications, not just for seafarers, but potentially for anyone who's ever dealt with a workplace injury and those tricky disability claims.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. Can't wait to hear what happens next.
We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll reveal the court's verdict and explore its wider impact. Stay tuned, deep divers. Okay, deep divers, let's get back into Richie Chan's story. We left off with that cliffhanger. What did the Philippine Supreme Court decide in this case?
This is the part where things get really interesting and potentially relevant to anyone who's ever dealt with a workplace injury.
I'm all ears. Did the court buy the company's argument that they did everything by the book?
Well, the Supreme Court actually sided with Richie.
Wow, really? They granted him total permanent disability benefits.
They did.
But I thought the company said they met all those POEA deadlines for the assessments and everything.
They did make that argument. But here's the thing. The court really dug into the specifics.
What do you mean?
Even if we say, for the sake of argument, that October 29th assessment was complete and final, which is debatable in itself,
Okay.
it was never actually communicated to Richie in a way that was clear and straightforward.
So even if they technically hit that 240-day mark, they messed up somewhere along the way.
Exactly. And this is huge. The court's decision basically says it's not enough for companies to just shuffle papers and meet deadlines.
You have to actually communicate properly with the injured worker. Make sure they understand what's happening with their case.
You got it.
This is making me think about all those other workplace injury cases we hear about, not just in the maritime industry. It seems like this idea of clear communication should be a basic standard everywhere, right?
Absolutely. This case could actually set a precedent for how companies handle these kinds of claims across all sorts of sectors. Think about it. Construction, office jobs, teachers, you name it.
So it applies to a teacher who hurts their back lifting a stack of textbooks.
It could. If you get hurt on the job, you'd want your employer to be upfront with you, right? Not keep you in the dark about what's going on with your claim.
No way. It's just basic fairness and respect.
Exactly. And the court really highlighted that in Richie's case.
How so?
They pointed out that he was left in limbo, not knowing what his options were or what was happening with his claim.
And in the end, that lack of communication from the company cost them big time.
Big time. It's like the court is saying, hey, treating your employees fairly isn't just the right thing to do ethically, it's also the smart thing to do legally.
I like that. So what can our listeners learn from all of this? What's the takeaway message here?
For me, it all comes down to awareness. If you know your rights as a worker, the proper procedures, and you make sure there's clear communication with your employer.
You're in a much better position if you ever face a situation like this.
Exactly. Knowledge is power.
All right, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from a seafarer's injury to a legal battle in the Philippines, and now we're talking about the implications for workplaces everywhere.
It's all connected.
It is. Before we wrap up Richie's story, what's the one thing our listeners should remember?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. If you get injured at work, make sure you understand your company's policies and procedures. Know who to report the injury to, what documents you need, and don't be afraid to ask questions if anything is unclear.
And if something doesn't feel right, don't hesitate to speak up or seek help from an expert.
Absolutely. Knowing your rights and being your own advocate is so crucial.
Well said. Big thanks to our expert for navigating us through this complex case and its wider impact.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we'll be back soon with another fascinating deep dive. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring the hidden depths of our world. Okay, deep divers, we're back for the final part of Richie Chan's story. We've covered a lot of ground already, from his injury on that ship, the conflicting medical opinions, all the way to that Philippine Supreme Court decision.
And a pretty big decision it was. Remember, they sided with Richie, granted him total permanent disability, even though the company argued they'd followed all the rules.
It all came down to that communication issue, right?
Yeah, the court really zeroed in on that. Even if that October 29th assessment was final, which is debatable, the way they handled it, the lack of clear communication with Richie, that's what really mattered in the end.
They were so focused on the paperwork and deadlines that they forgot about the human element.
Right, and the court basically said, that's not good enough. It's not just about checking boxes. It's about treating people fairly and making sure they understand what's happening.
So this whole thing about clear communication, it got me thinking. This isn't just about seafarers, right? This could have implications for all sorts of workplaces.
Absolutely. Think about it. Disability claims happen in every industry.
Construction, office jobs, even teachers, like we talked about before.
Exactly. If you get hurt on the job, no matter what you do, you deserve to be kept in the loop, to know what's going on with your claim, your rights.
It shouldn't matter if you're a CEO or a janitor, right?
Exactly. So this case, even though it's specific to the maritime industry, it could really push companies and other sectors to take a closer look at their own procedures for handling disability claims.
Like, are they just going through the motions, or are they genuinely communicating with their employees in a clear and straightforward way?
That's the question. It's
Yeah.
about raising the bar for everyone, setting a new standard for transparency and fairness in the workplace.
And that all ties back to that idea of knowledge is power.
Right. The more informed you are as a worker, the better prepared you'll be to navigate these situations if they ever come up.
So what's our takeaway for the listeners? What can they do to be more informed and empowered?
Well, first and foremost, don't be afraid to ask questions. If you get injured on the job, make sure you really understand your company's policies, who you should report to, what paperwork you need.
And if something doesn't feel right or you're not getting clear answers,
Speak up. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself or even reach out to an expert for help.
great advice. Well, deep divers, we've reached the end of our exploration of Richie Chan's story. And it's amazing how much ground we've covered. We started with a seafarer's injury in the Philippines.
And now we're talking about the potential impact on workplaces all over the world.
It just goes to show that these deep dives can uncover some pretty surprising connections.
Absolutely. It all comes back to that ripple effect. Even seemingly specific cases can set precedents and spark bigger conversations.
And that's what we're all about here on the deep dive. Huge thanks to our expert for guiding us through the complexities of this case.
My pleasure. Always happy to dive deep with you.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us. Remember, stay curious and never stop exploring the hidden depths of our world. We'll be back soon with another fascinating case. But until then, happy diving.